Two brothers, one legendary father, and two completely different paths that neither of them chose. When John Lennon was shot outside his New York apartment in December 1980, he left behind more than just music that changed the world. He left behind two sons who would spend the rest of their lives trying to figure out who they were beyond being John Lennon's son. Today, in 2025, Julian Lennon is 62 years old and Sean Lennon is 49. They share the same famous last name and the same tragic loss, but their stories couldn't be more different. One grew up feeling abandoned and had to fight for recognition. The other grew up surrounded by love but lived in the shadow of expectation. Both are talented musicians in their own right, both carrying the weight of a legacy they never asked for. This is their story, told honestly, about what it's really like to be the children of a legend. Julian Lennon was born in April 1963 to John Lennon and his first wife, Cynthia. He was born right at the moment when Beatlemania was starting to explode, which meant his father was about to become one of the most famous people on earth. For the first few years of Julian's life, John was there, at least physically. There are photos of young Julian with his dad, sitting at the piano, playing in the garden. But as the Beatles got bigger and bigger, John was home less and less. The tours, the recording sessions, the constant demands of fame pulled him away from family life. Then in 1968, everything changed. John met Yoko Ono, fell deeply in love, and his marriage to Cynthia fell apart. John and Cynthia divorced, and John moved on quickly to his new life with Yoko. For Julian, who was only 5 years old, this was devastating. His father essentially left, choosing his new relationship and his new life over staying connected to his first family. Julian has been very open in interviews over the years about how much this hurt him. He said that his father became a stranger to him during those years, that he rarely saw him, and that when they did spend time together, it was awkward and uncomfortable. What made it even more painful was that John Lennon wrote and sang about peace and love and understanding. But according to Julian, he didn't show much of that to his own son. Julian has said in multiple interviews that his father could be cold and distant with him, that he felt rejected and unwanted. There's a famous story about how Paul McCartney wrote Hey Jude to comfort Julian during his parents' divorce. Paul felt bad for the little boy going through such a hard time, so he wrote him a song. That tells you something about the situation, that it was John's bandmate, not John himself, who was trying to make Julian feel better. As Julian grew up, the distance between him and his father continued. John moved to New York with Yoko in 1971, and Julian stayed in England with his mother. They would go years without seeing each other. Julian has talked about how strange it was to hear his father's new music on the radio, including songs about his new son Sean, while feeling completely cut off from his dad's life. It created wounds that would take decades to even begin healing. Then in 1975, Sean Lennon was born. John was 35 years old, and he made a decision that changed everything. He decided to step back from music completely and focus on being a father to Sean. He called it his house husband period. For 5 years, from 1975 to 1980, John Lennon barely made any music. Instead, he took care of Sean, changed diapers, baked bread, and devoted himself to being the kind of present, involved father he had never been to Julian. It was beautiful in many ways, this idea of a rock star giving up fame to raise his child. But for Julian, watching this from across the ocean, it must have been incredibly painful. The father who had barely been there for him was now being the perfect dad to his younger half-brother. Sean grew up in a completely different world than Julian. He was raised in the Dakota Building in New York City, surrounded by wealth, creativity, and to parents who were deeply devoted to him. John documented Sean's childhood extensively, took thousands of photos, wrote songs about him. Yoko was equally devoted, protecting Sean and making sure he had everything he needed. When John was killed in 1980, Sean was only 5 years old, the same age Julian had been when his parents divorced. But the difference was that Sean had known his father's love intensely for those 5 years, while Julian had spent most of his childhood feeling abandoned. After John's death, the paths of the two brothers diverged even more. Julian was 17 years old when his father was murdered. He said that his feelings were complicated, that he was sad but also angry because he had lost any chance of ever repairing their relationship. All the conversations they would never have, all the understanding they might have reached, it was all gone forever. He's talked about going to the funeral and feeling like an outsider, like he wasn't really part of John's real family. The whole situation made things worse. When John's estate was settled, the bulk of his fortune went to Yoko and Sean. Julian received a relatively small amount, considering his father's wealth. This led 2 years of legal battles. Julian felt he had been treated unfairly, that his father had essentially written him out of his life even in death. Eventually, in the 1990s, a settlement was reached, but the whole situation left bitter feelings and damaged relationships. Julian decided to pursue music, which makes sense given his genes and his upbringing. He released his first album, Valat, in 1980 when he was 21 years old. The album was actually quite successful, reaching number 17 on the charts and earning him a Grammy nomination. His voice sounded remarkably like his father's, which was both a blessing and a curse. People were interested in him because of who his father was, but they also constantly compared him to John, which made it hard for Julian to establish his own identity. He released several more albums over the years, had a few hit songs, but never reached the level of superstardom that might have been expected given his last name. Julian has been honest about struggling with this. He said that being John Lennon's son opened doors for him, but it also created impossible expectations. People wanted him to be his father, to write songs like his father, to have the same genius. But Julian is his own person, with his own talents and his own artistic vision, and he spent years trying to get people to see that. Beyond music, Julian has found other passions. He's become a serious photographer, publishing books of his work and having exhibitions around the world. He's also very involved in environmental and humanitarian causes, running the White Feather Foundation, which is named after something his father once told him about white feathers being a sign from the universe. Julian has channeled a lot of his energy into trying to make a positive difference in the world, working on issues like clean water access, indigenous rights, and climate change. When you listen to Julian talk in recent interviews, you hear someone who has done a lot of healing work but still carries pain. He's been in therapy for years, working through his feelings about his father, his childhood, and his place in the world. He's talked openly about how abandonment issues have affected his relationships, how he struggled with trust and intimacy. He's never married and has no children, which he said is partially because he's afraid of repeating his father's mistakes. Sean's journey has been different in almost every way. He grew up with his mother Yoko as his primary parent after John's death. Yoko was fiercely protective of Sean, keeping him out of the spotlight as much as possible during his childhood, trying to give him as normal a life as possible given the circumstances. But normal is relative when your father was John Lennon and your mother is Yoko Ono, and you're growing up in the Dakota with access to some of the most creative and influential people in the world. Sean started making music seriously in the late 1990s. His style is very different from both his father's and his brother's. Sean's music is more experimental, more avant-garde, influenced by his mother's artistic sensibilities as much as his father's rock and roll roots. He's worked with various bands and collaborators, never seeming too concerned with commercial success or trying to live up to the Lennon name. He's carved out his own niche in the music world, respected by fellow artists and critics, even if he's not a household name. What's interesting about Sean is that he seems more at peace with his father's legacy than Julian is. Maybe that's because he knew his father's love so completely during those crucial early years. Maybe it's because he didn't have to compete for John's attention the way Julian did. Or maybe it's just a difference in personality. Sean talks about his father with warmth and nostalgia, sharing memories and stories, seeming grateful for the time they had rather than bitter about what was lost. Sean is also very close to his mother. He and Yoko have worked together on various projects over the years, managing John's legacy, overseeing releases of archival material, and protecting John's artistic vision. Sean has taken on the role of guardian of his father's memory in many ways, speaking at tributes, giving interviews about John's impact, and helping new generations discover his father's music. The relationship between Julian and Sean has been complicated over the years. They didn't grow up together, didn't really know each other as children. They were raised in different countries by different mothers with very different circumstances. For a long time, they weren't close. The legal battles over the estate created tension. The pain Julian felt about being left out of his father's life and legacy created resentment that was hard for Sean to understand, since he had never experienced that rejection. But in recent years, there have been signs that the brothers are finding some common ground. They've both spoken about reaching out to each other, having conversations, trying to build a relationship as adults that they never had as children. It's not easy. They're very different people with very different experiences, but they share something that no one else in the world shares. They're both John Lennon's sons. They both lost their father in different ways. and they both carry that legacy forward. Julian is now in his early 60s. When you look at recent photos and interviews, you see someone who has aged well, who seems more settled than he did in his younger years. He splits his time between various homes around the world, continues his photography and environmental work, and occasionally makes music when he feels inspired. He's talked about writing a memoir, wanting to tell his full story in his own words. There's a sense that he's finally making peace with his past, accepting that his father was a flawed human being who hurt him, but also gave him gifts of creativity and sensitivity. Sean is approaching 50, still actively making music, still collaborating with interesting artists, still living in New York and being part of the creative community there. He seems comfortable in his own skin in a way that's admirable. He doesn't seem to be trying to be John Lennon or live up to impossible standards. He's just Sean, making the art he wants to make, living the life he wants to live. Both brothers have had to answer the same question their entire lives: what's it like to be John Lennon's son? And both have learned that there's no simple answer. It's opened doors and created opportunities. It's also created pressures and expectations and comparisons that are exhausting. It's given them access to incredible experiences and also made it hard to know if people value them for themselves or just for their famous name. The story of Julian and Sean Lennon is ultimately a human story about family, about fathers and sons, about siblings finding their way in the world. Yes, their father was extraordinary, but the challenges they've faced are ones that many people can relate to. Feeling rejected by a parent, living in someone else's shadow, trying to build a relationship with a sibling you barely know, dealing with grief and loss, finding your own identity separate from your family name. In 2025, both brothers are still here, still creating, still living lives that honor their father's memory in different ways. Julian through his humanitarian work and his determination to be authentic, Sean through his music and his role as keeper of his father's legacy. Neither one has had an easy path, but both have survived and even thrived in their own ways. They're proof that even if you're born into extraordinary circumstances, you still have to do the ordinary work of being human, of healing from wounds, of figuring out who you are and what matters to you. Let us know in the comments which brother's story resonates more with you.